Hello. You may remember that in one of the past videos I mentioned that David here gave me a challenge, and that was to find the paradise promise in the mouths of the apostles in the book of Acts, or in the Gospels, or in the letters, right, of the New Testament. And so I thought, well, that'll be no problem. That'll be easy. And I started to read the book of Acts, looking at the preaching, and no paradise, no last days. So I was really stuck. And then in reading the letters of Paul, I found out that there were really serious conditions attached to anyone who preached a false gospel. There would be serious consequences. I wanted to read those to you from Paul's letter in Galatians, chapter 1, verses 6 to 9. Is that right, Daddy?
Mm-hmm.
I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed.
Well, that's the most serious anathema or imprecation that Paul ever utters that I can remember in his epistles about any kind of distortion of the truth. So it assumes, though, that it is possible to keep a continuous tradition going from the first days of the apostles right until the Lord's return, apparently. So, of course, if you're in a cult like the Watchtower, you don't believe that has happened. You believe there was a break in that tradition right away after the apostles died, and that was only restored, of course, by you, your guys. Mm-hmm. So it does beg the question of, we made, again, a reference in another video to the continuity of tradition from the apostles to today in the creeds of the church, and also continuity of the Old Testament tradition from Moses to Malachi. And back about 20 years ago, we were desirous of making this clearer, that this idea that not just the Watchtower, but many other dissident groups, cults, have about church tradition is a false notion based upon a partial reading of what the New Testament says about tradition. So we wanted to set this double truth about tradition in the light of the New Testament and the Old Testament precedent. So we composed this tract, Paradise and Paradosis, The Watchtower and Remembrance, to set about seeing the continuity of both Testaments when it comes to keeping the balanced view of tradition. Mm-hmm. So the text that I chose to start with was Deuteronomy 32 verse 7, where Moses, before he dies, commands Israel this way. He says in Deuteronomy 32 verse 7, remember the days of old, consider the years of all generations, ask your father and he will inform you, and your elders and they will tell you. So Moses too, like Paul, assumes that it will be possible to keep the tradition of Israel alive, not by an infallible document that he's going to leave behind, but by oral tradition passed on from family to family to generation. So we wrote the need this way. Let me read to you from the tract. Faced with dwindling memberships, local chapters of the Royal Canadian Legion wonder aloud not only how they can keep their doors open much longer, but also how, with the dying off of our World War II veterans, the memory of their sacrifice will be kept alive at all. And with a parallel fear, Steven Spielberg, the world's most successful commercial film producer, is spending much of his personal resources on a massive project which involves recording on video the recollections of Holocaust survivors before that generation too has died off. Is it really true that we could forget World War II and the Holocaust when I wrote this, of course, it was only 2 generations in the past. Now it's more like 3. And I think the success of neo-Nazi propagandists in recent years has shown that indeed the veterans and Spielberg had something real to fear. Memory of the recent past has died among the present generation. So in the Bible itself, you see that this is not a new phenomenon, that in the book of Ecclesiastes we have this in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 11 and 2 verse 16. There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten. So this phenomenon of erasing the past is obviously something that is very old. And when Koheleth says it here in Ecclesiastes, he's not raising a hymn or a paean to progress when he says this. He is simply lamenting this historical reality. The biblical writers see the best solution to defective or selective memory as the memory of the community. Israel was not only to remember her wars and her war dead, which they did remember in the books of Kings and Chronicles and Samuel without commemorating them. She was also to remember all the deeds of her God, and so the histories of the Old Testament are replete with repeated history of the more important facts of the past. So protecting the nation against this memory lapse or distortion was collective oral memory.
Yeah. The emphasis was, when you were talking about the remembering, the emphasis was on what God had done for them.
Yeah.
And that was being passed on to children from generation to generation.
So remembrance for them was not one day a year, a remembrance day, although they had several of those obviously in the festivals. Remembrance was a life task for Israel.
Yeah.
So in the next segment we'll talk about the credibility and historical continuity which gives credibility to the written records that were to come much later in Israel's history.